When the Allies and Axis troops worked together, the Second World War is known for its brutality, with both the Allies and the Axis powers fighting tooth and nail for supremacy. In spite of this, however, there were some incidents in which soldiers from one side actively or inadvertently aided their enemies. Whether this was done out of a sense of morality, ideology, or some reason known only to them, here are a few examples of when Axis and Allies worked together. The Battle of Itter Castle. By May 1945, with VE Day just around the corner and the Nazi reign of terror coming to an end, one final battle remained. In the Austrian Alps, Castle Itter was a fortification that dated back to the 13th century. During the war, it was under the administrative control of the Dachau concentration camp, about 90 miles away. The castle was used by the SS to incarcerate high-value prisoners, particularly those who had potential value as hostages, mostly French nationals, including 2 former prime ministers, as well as several generals and prominent political figures. On May 4th, the guards of Castle Itter abandoned their posts and fled, leaving the confused inmates uncertain about their fate. In the surrounding area were various Gestapo and Waffen-SS units, who were executing anyone who attempted to surrender. It was feared that the SS would liquidate these high-value prisoners as a last act of defiance. The prisoners sent 2 messengers off seeking aid, with one of them finding an American unit. Though it was outside of their operational jurisdiction, a small rescue party led by Tank Commander Jack C. Lee was dispatched to the castle. The other messenger found Wehrmacht Major Sepp Gangl, a German officer who was disillusioned with the Nazi cause. Both units met up with each other and agreed to work together to protect the prisoners, with Lee placing his Sherman tank at the castle's entrance. The next day, a Waffen-SS unit arrived and were met by a combined force of American GIs, Wehrmacht deserters, and a number of French and Austrian prisoners using small arms left behind by Itter's guards. Lee's tank was knocked out, though no casualties were suffered. The fighting lasted all day, with the defenders running out of ammunition. Just as their last rounds were expended, elements of the 142nd Infantry Regiment arrived, engaging the SS troops, capturing over 100 and killing or scattering the rest. The only death on the defenders' side was Gangl, who was hit after shoving a prisoner out of danger, though 4 others were wounded, ending one of the strangest battles of World War II. Luftwaffe fighter escorts American bomber. On December 20th, 1943, a flight of B-17 heavy bombers were making their way to Bremen, Germany, targeting a factory that produced the FW-190 fighters. One of these, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was piloted by Charlie Brown. As they made their approach, German anti-aircraft flak guns opened up with devastating effect. The barrage tore open the plexiglass nose, sending sub-zero winds into the aircraft. Subsequent hits knocked out one engine and damaged another. With power reduced, the bomber fell out of formation and was immediately surrounded by swarms of German fighters. In the ensuing fight, another engine was damaged, the tail gunner was killed, the rest of the crew wounded, and the defensive guns reduced to the dorsal turret and single nose gun. Brown turned the plane and headed towards England, but with any hope of safely reaching there, rapidly fading. As Ye Old Pub limped home, the wounded and frozen crew were greeted by a baffling sight. To the side of the bomber was a German Messerschmitt Bf-109, flown by Franz Stigler, who, instead of finishing off the crippled flying fortress, waved. After seeing the condition the men were in, he could not bring himself to finish them off. Stigler tried to signal Brown to land the bomber safely in Germany or to neutral Sweden, where they could land and be interned. Brown was confused as to what Stigler was trying to communicate and continued to pilot his crippled plane towards England. Rather than abandon them, Stigler flew in close formation with the bomber, which prevented German anti-aircraft guns from firing at them. As they left German airspace, Stigler saluted before returning home. Brown managed to make the trip back to England, landing safely. Both Brown and Stigler would survive the war and would meet in much more peaceful circumstances in 1990 and would remain friends until their deaths in 2008. The Niche Incident, when the Americans inadvertently helped the Axis side. On November 7, 1944, the American 82nd Operations Group based in Italy was providing support for Soviet forces, particularly the 6th Guards Rifle Corps, which was making its way towards Belgrade. Near the town of Niš, Yugoslavia, now Serbia, a flight of P-38 Lightning fighter planes spotted what they thought was a convoy of German troops. There are multiple versions of what happened next. What can be agreed upon is that the Lightnings began an attack on the Soviet convoy, strafing it with machine guns and rockets, killing 34, including the 6th Guard Corps commander, and destroying about 20 trucks. The Soviets called for their own fighters, thinking they were under attack from Luftwaffe FW-189s, which have a similar twin-body design as the P-38. When the Yak-9 and Yak-3 fighters arrived on the scene, they began dogfighting the Americans, which lasted about 15 minutes. A number of aircraft on both sides were shot down, though the exact figures are disputed. Eventually, the Americans realized they were fighting the Soviets and broke off the attack. Another wave of P-38s was inbound, but they were intercepted by the Soviet fighters, who showed the red star on their aircraft, and they returned back to base without any further incident. To this day, there is no official reasoning for the engagement. Intelligence reports indicated that there were no German troops in the region, adding suspicion that the attack was deliberate. Additionally, the dogfight lasted for 15 minutes, with none of the Americans noticing the red star on the Soviet fighters, which looks nothing like the Luftwaffe cross or swastika. There are some reports that the Americans had made a navigation error and believed they were over enemy territory. The Soviets had also advanced much more quickly than anticipated, and their presence in the region may have been a surprise to the American forces. Officially, the incident was determined to be an unfortunate friendly fire incident, and the Americans sent an official apology to the Soviets. Though it may just be a case of mistaken identity, rumors persist that the attack was deliberate. It is impossible to determine, as much of the information on what had occurred is still classified to this day. American pilot defects. By 1944, the war was going firmly in favor of the Allies, with the Axis forces suffering setbacks on both the eastern and western fronts. In spite of this, at least one Allied soldier took his chances, throwing his lot in with the Axis cause. Martin James Monty had joined the U.S. Army Air Corps, qualifying as a pilot, and was sent to Karachi, India, now Pakistan, where his service was uneventful. In late 1944, Monty deserted, hitching a ride on a C-46 bound for Cairo, Egypt, then numerous stops until his destination of Pomigliano Airfield north of Naples. Once there, he located a P-38 Lightning that was awaiting testing after repairs. He stole the plane and headed towards German-held Milan. Once there, he defected and spent some time as a prisoner of the suspicious Germans. Monty was later released after he convinced them of his sincerity. As to why he defected, he was an ardent anti-communist and believed that the war was a communist plot and that Germany and the US should ally against the Soviet Union, their true enemy. He offered his services to the Nazi war effort and was sent to Berlin, where he began a radio broadcast urging his fellow Americans to stop fighting against Germany and turn their attention to the evil Soviets. Broadcasting under the name Martin Vithopt, his program lasted only a few sessions before his radio career ended. As for the plane he piloted, the Germans eagerly took possession of the P-38, repainting the craft with their own markings, which was then used by the Luftwaffe until the end of the war. As the war ended, Monty escaped Berlin and made his way back to Italy, where he turned himself in to the Americans. He was taken into custody and later charged with desertion, receiving a 15-year suspended sentence. It wasn't until 1948 when his defection and propaganda activities were discovered. He was charged with treason and faced a potential death penalty. Monty pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 25 years imprisonment and a $10,000 fine, though he was paroled in 1960. He tried, without success, to have his conviction overturned, eventually dying in 2000. British, French, and Norwegian SS units. The Waffen-SS was the military arm of the German Nazi Party, outside of the Wehrmacht. In spite of being associated with a German political party, the SS eagerly recruited members from other nations, placing them in combat roles. In German-occupied Norway, large numbers of Norwegians joined the German military in all of its branches, including the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine, and the Luftwaffe. Overall, around 50,000 Norwegians fought for the Third Reich, with large numbers also joining the Norwegian Legion, an SS unit founded in 1941. After their formation, the Legion was deployed to the Leningrad front, where they participated in the protracted siege of the city. After enduring heavy casualties as a result of heavy Soviet counterattacks, the Legion would be disbanded in 1943. Those who wished to continue fighting for the SS were transferred over to the newly formed 11th Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, where they continued to fight for the Germans. In addition to the Norwegians, the Nordland Division also contained a large number of Danes who also joined the Nazi cause, and by the end of the war, volunteers from Hungary, the Netherlands, Britain, Finland, Romania, France, Spain, Switzerland, Estonia, and Sweden had joined or been attached to the unit. The Nordland Division would continue to fight until the war's end in 1945, with many fighting to the death against the Allied advance. Those that were captured were often repatriated to their home countries in order to face trial for treason. Some SS units were recruited out of desperation. By 1944, Germany was losing ground on all fronts and desperately needed manpower to plug the gaps. Known as the British Free Corps, the unit was made up of British and Commonwealth POWs, recruited with the intention of fighting the Soviets. The results were less than inspiring. Information about the British Free Corps is difficult to obtain, though it's estimated that at its height it consisted of around 27 members. A few of the men were dedicated to the proposed mission, but the majority were inept or incapable combatants, bordering on incompetent, some with extensive criminal and disciplinary records against them. Most of the men looked for any opportunity to desert, and the BFC never saw combat with the unit disbanded shortly after its creation. In German-dominated Vichy France, the SS also recruited another unit, one whose quality was the complete opposite. The 33rd Waffen-Grenadier Division of the SS, also known as the 1st French SS Division and the Charlemagne Division, was founded in 1944, made up from other French units that had served with the Third Reich as early as 1941, such as the Legion of French Volunteers Against Bolshevism, or LVF, and the 8th Volunteer Sturmbrigade France, which saw action on the Eastern Front. In 1944, both of these units were disbanded and reformed into the 33rd Grenadier Division. At its height, the division had around 7,000 members, though heavy fighting whittled down this number to a mere 700 by April 1945. About half were sent to assist a construction battalion, while the rest were deployed to Berlin. There they were assigned to guard the Führer's bunker. They fought fiercely, knowing the fate that awaited traitors, fighting the Soviets almost to the last man, and was one of the last units to offer resistance in the German capital, the 30 or so survivors surrendering on May 2, 1945. Of the members who escaped, some made their way to France, where they were captured by the Allies. Some were put on trial and sentenced to prison, though many were shot on the spot as traitors to their homeland. In the deadliest conflict in world history, members of the Axis and Allied armed forces, due to personal convictions, ideology, or any other reason known only to them, set aside their differences and worked alongside one another. The U.S. Army and Wehrmacht versus the SS. Epic Horse VIP Rescue Mission, Operation Cowboy. Hunkered down in their positions, U.S. Army Captain Thomas M. Stewart surveyed the motley assortment of men under his command. Some were from Poland, Britain, and France. Others hailed from as far afield as Yugoslavia, Russia, and there were even a few New Zealanders for good measure. To an outside observer, though, by far the most surprising thing was the sight of German Wehrmacht soldiers fighting alongside American soldiers. What followed was one of the strangest and most beautiful operations of the Second World War. But first, a bit of backstory. Originating from the Habsburg Empire, the White Lipizzaner is a rare breed of show horse that's world-renowned. Prized for their beauty, grace, and temperament, their bloodline can be traced back more than 400 years. It was this purity that brought them to the attention of the Nazis. You see, they weren't just interested in making Aryan humans. By crossbreeding Lipizzaners with other pure-blooded breeds, they also hoped to make a super race of Aryan horse. This bizarre program first got underway when they transferred all of the Lipizzaner female horses to a specialized farm in Hostau, Czechoslovakia, after the German conquest of Austria in 1938. They would stay right until the last months of World War II. By then, Czechoslovakia was in a bit of a complicated place. Because the Germans were definitely going to lose the war, the Allied leaders were already dividing up the spoils of the collapsing Third Reich. Crucially, at the Yalta Conference of February 1945, they had all agreed to let the Soviet Union take over Czechoslovakia when the hostilities ended. Because of this, by April 1945, the Soviet Red Army was stationed 40 miles east of Hostau, waiting for the signal to advance into Czechoslovakia. But the Americans were also around too. They were posted a bit closer, 20 miles west of Hostau, waiting for orders to liberate Prague. Stuck in the middle were the German veterinary officers of the Wehrmacht, the armed forces branch of the Nazi war machine. They had been caring for the majestic white Lipizzaners for the whole conflict, and they were seriously worried about them because the Russians didn't give a damn about horses. Their anxieties were wholly justified. The Soviets had already destroyed another prized equine collection, the Royal Hungarian Lipizzaners, earlier in the war. Instead of being looked after, these elegant creatures had either been shot or worked to death like common pack horses. The Wehrmacht vets knew that when the Red Army came rolling in, their precious animals would suffer the same humiliating fate. This put the German commanders of the farm in a tricky position. The most senior of them, Lieutenant Colonel Holters, was actually a member of a mysterious German Intel Air Force unit. He'd ended up in Hostal by chance when his unit had run out of fuel and became stranded. While there, he had befriended the facility's ranking Wehrmacht officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rodofsky, and both men had quickly bonded over their common love of horses. When the word of the Soviet invasion came in, Holters tried to convince his friend to hand over the mares to the Americans. Initially, Rodofsky agreed, but at the last minute, compelled by a sense of loyalty to the fatherland, he changed his mind. Holters, on the other hand, didn't care about his oath. All he cared about was the survival of the white Lipizzaners, and so, in secret, he made contact with the Americans to the west. The unit he encountered there was the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Cavalry Group of the 12th Corps of General George Patton's 3rd Army. It was commanded by Colonel Charles M. Reed, a Virginian gentleman well known for his love of polo, and many of its members were experienced horsemen. Despite technically being enemies, their shared affinity for horses united them, and a rescue plan involving an unlikely partnership of Americans and Germans began to take shape. The operation was not simple by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, it was incredibly complex with lots of unpredictable factors. First, while the Wehrmacht officers at Hostal were friendly, the hordes of German troops patrolling the region were not. They hadn't been informed of the secret mission, so they were going to shoot when they saw Americans striking into their territory. In addition to this, most of the battle-hardened troops of the 42nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, completely worn out by 9 months of brutal fighting, just wanted to go home and didn't want to risk their lives again. A third complication was the fact that many of the horses were pregnant and some had just given birth. In the meantime, the Soviet Red Army could advance at any moment. With the clock ticking, General George Patton approved the plan and ordered his men to make it quick. Unable to allocate enough men or resources, only 2 small cavalry reconnaissance units and just a few scraps of armor were scrambled for the mission leaders, Colonel Reed and Major Andrews. In total, just 325 men, 5 small M24 Chaffee light tanks, a pair of howitzer motor carriages, and a handful of machine gun-armed jeeps and M8 armored cars were expected to strike into a region defended by tens of thousands of German troops that were backed up by 2 panzer divisions. Operation Cowboy. On April 28, 1945, Operation Cowboy got going with a massive artillery strike that smashed a hole in the German front line. The Americans poured into the breach and valiantly fought village to village against stiff opposition. By some sort of miracle, they actually managed to advance 20 miles to the farm. When they arrived, both commanders sprung into action. While Colonel Reed rounded up enough vehicles to evacuate the horses, Major Andrews entrusted his deputy, Captain Stewart, with defense. This would be the toughest test of his military career. Stewart had only been left with 180 men, and the news was that an SS regiment was en route to wipe them and the horses out. More bodies were needed, and they were needed fast. At first, the captain armed the small band of prisoners of war found at the facility, a mixture of Brits, New Zealanders, French, Poles, and Yugoslavs with captured German weapons. He then further bolstered his ranks with a column of anti-communist Russian Cossacks, whose leader was a former prince. 4 years earlier, they had actually sided with the Nazis after Hitler's invasion of Russia. But now that the Soviets were closing in, they were keen to escape, even if it meant having to fight alongside their former enemies. Finally, Stewart asked the Wehrmacht Colonel Rodofsky if he'd like to join them. There was one catch: he would only agree to arm them if they pledged allegiance to the United States. Faced with an almost certain death at the hands of the Soviets, Radovsky and his men, many of whom also had no love for the Nazis, took up the offer and fell in line with the Americans. Now all that was left to do was to wait. Before long, the field in front of the farm was enveloped in gunfire as the unlikely Foreign Legion, jokingly called themselves Stuart's Foreign Legion, were assaulted by the first wave of SS raiders. Working together, they repulsed not one, but two separate assaults by crack troops from the SS Regiment Deutschland. Luckily for them, the SS hadn't brought any tanks, which made beating them back fairly easy. By the end, more than 100 SS soldiers had been killed in the firefight, with many of them slain by their own countrymen, while only a couple of Americans had been killed or injured. A break in combat then gave Colonel Reed the opportunity to get things going. Soviet T-34 tanks had been spotted, and there was no time to lose. Herded into the back of German and American trucks, corralled between the American tanks, or ridden pell-mell back to the U.S. lines by American Wehrmacht and Cossack officers. One by one, the White Lipizaners and their baby foals were evacuated just as the Russians were entering the outskirts of Hostau. When the last of the horses had gone, a tense standoff ensued between the Soviets and the Americans. However, the Russians decided it wasn't worth attacking them, and so no more blood was shed that day. Having been whisked away to safety behind U.S. lines, the White Lipizaners were returned to their home at the Spanish riding school in Austria, where their descendants remain to this day. Later on, after the dust had settled on Operation Cowboy, Colonel Reed explained why he had risked everything to save them. "We were so tired of death and destruction," he recalled, "so we wanted to do something beautiful."
The Dai Hong Dan incident. When North Korea and the US work together. Nothing unites quite like a common enemy. Since the 1950s, the United States and North Korea have had a relationship that can generously be described as difficult. Both nations fought one another during the Korean War, and even to this day are warily eyeing one another across the demilitarized zone on the Korean peninsula. In spite of this rocky past, on one occasion, both nations managed to set aside their differences for a common goal, despite still being technically at war. In October of 2007, North Korean cargo vessel the Dai Hong Dan had just delivered its cargo of sugar from India to the Somali capital of Mogadishu and was returning home. On October 29th, about 70 miles north of Mogadishu in the Indian Ocean, the ship was overtaken by a group of 7 Somali pirates, who posed as guards to gain access to the vessel. Reportedly, these same men were dock workers who were responsible for the safe passage of the ship when it entered and exited Mogadishu harbor. Somalia had been without a stable government since 1991, when dictator Mohammed Siad Barre had been overthrown, and the nation's economy remained in shambles. Illegal overfishing by foreign fisheries also left local fishermen without a source of income. Situated on the Horn of Africa, Somalia is located next to one of the major global shipping lanes in the Gulf of Aden, which connects to the Red Sea and the Suez Canal, as well as the Strait of Hormuz, both vital arteries for global trade. With such bounties floating just offshore, piracy was inevitable. Piracy became so common, it developed into a sustainable industry, eventually featuring a sort of stock market where backers can invest money, weapons, boats, and other equipment for the pirates, sharing in the profits. Each year, hundreds of ships would be attacked, with their crews held hostage for ransom and their cargo seized. The loss of the cargo, the ransoms paid for the release of the crews, security precautions, such as armed guards and more extensive naval patrols, and rerouted shipping lanes to avoid pirate-infested waters, cost the global economy billions of dollars annually. Pirates generally use small, fast-moving boats, which they use to board the target vessel, anything from cargo ships to tankers, or anything that may be a promising target. Valuables would be taken, though often the most lucrative thing stolen would be the crew themselves, who could be ransomed to their respective countries. The number of pirate attacks has waxed and waned over the years, and has been greatly reduced due to international efforts. But the problem still persists, and in all likelihood will continue into the foreseeable future. When the pirates seized the Dai Hong Dan, they herded the 22 members of the crew into the ship's engine room and steering room, and demanded a $15,000 ransom for their release. If they did not receive the money, the pirates were willing to execute the crew. Before they were detained, however, the crew of the Dai Hong Dan managed to perform two critical actions. First, they shut down the engine, telling the pirates they were experiencing engine issues. Secondly, and more critically, they managed to send out a distress call. In a matter of hours, their distress call traveled from an institution in the North Korean capital of Pyongyang to the North Korean embassy in London, then onto the International Maritime Bureau's Piracy Reporting Center in Malaysia, who messaged the Combined Maritime Forces headquarters in Bahrain, until finally making contact with the closest naval vessel to the Dai Hong Dan. The International Maritime Bureau was established in 1991, coinciding with the collapse of the Somali government and the rise of piracy. The organization is an international effort to combat maritime theft around the globe, acting as an intermediary, picking up calls for assistance, and relaying the information to appropriate military forces in order to handle the threat as quickly as possible. The closest naval vessel to the Dai Hong Dan was the USS James E. Williams DDG-95, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer which was operating in the region. When it received the information and location of the captured vessel, the Williams diverted course and headed towards the stricken Dai Hong Dan. As the destroyer approached the captured vessel, it launched an SH-60B Seahawk helicopter. This aircraft, the workhorse of the U.S. Navy, is a maritime version of the ubiquitous UH-60 Black Hawk multi-purpose helicopter used by the U.S. and other armed forces. Like its land counterpart, the Seahawk is a versatile craft and is capable of fulfilling multiple roles, including search and rescue, anti-ship and anti-submarine operations, cargo and personnel transport, special operations, and a number of other functions. On board the USS James E. Williams was a VBSS team, meaning visit, board, search, and seizure. This was a team of trained specialists whose role involved boarding ships to search for contraband, including drugs, weapons, or any other smuggled goods, as well as combating terrorism and, in time of conflict, capturing enemy vessels. During their training, they learned the ins and outs of boarding, searching, and fighting on board an enemy vessel. This is a particularly risky task, as the close confines of a ship, with its narrow passageways, the maze of corridors, and often poorly lit interiors are full of potential dangers. Every hatch is a fatal funnel for waiting defenders, and on larger vessels, it is easy to become lost and disoriented in the labyrinth of an unfamiliar ship. As the destroyer approached the Dai Hong Dan, it ordered the pirates to surrender. With the distraction provided by the arrival of the Americans, the captors diverted their attention from the hostages, who took matters into their own hands. The imprisoned North Koreans seized the opportunity and, outnumbering their captors by 22-7, they fought back, using weapons they wrestled from the pirates guarding the engine room against them. North Korea had a 10-year mandatory military service for its citizens, making the crew of the Dai Hong Dan proficient in fighting, catching the pirates off guard, and significantly increasing their odds of success. Eventually, the Dai Hong Dan was secured and the pirates were overpowered. One of the pirates was killed, 6 North Korean crewmen were wounded, 3 being severely injured. The latter were transferred to the James E. Williams for medical treatment. By a stroke of luck, on board the Williams was a second-generation Korean immigrant who spoke Korean and was able to act as an interpreter between the North Koreans and the Americans. Reportedly, the wounded sailors expressed extreme gratitude to the Americans for their medical assistance. They were transferred back to the Dai Hong Dan, which soon continued its journey. When word of the incident reached the North Korean leadership, they took an unprecedented step in praising the United States. In an official statement, the government of North Korea released a statement describing the events of the incident, ending with thanks to one of their great political rivals, stating, "We feel grateful to the United States for its assistance given to our crewmen. This case serves as a symbol of the DPRK-U.S. cooperation in the struggle against terrorism. We will continue to render international cooperation in the fight against terrorism in the future, too." There was some hope that the incident would act as a catalyst for further peaceful relations between the two rival nations, who would shortly afterwards engage in nuclear disarmament talks. A spokesperson for the United States stated, "You will always find our Navy prepared to help any ship in distress. I hope the DPRK understands that we do this out of a sense of goodwill. Unfortunately, in spite of any goodwill that may have been generated by the incident, tensions remained high between the opposing nations and had little, if any, long-term effects. Still, the Dai Hong Dan incident is one of the more unusual events in the long and turbulent relationship between the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It just goes to show that even the bitterest of foes can work together when faced with a common enemy.
Japan's Asian allies of World War II. Immediately following the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Imperial Japan launched several invasions and assaults on European and American colonial and imperialist provinces across the Pacific Islands and Eastern Asia. Japan's empire was, however, overextended, outmanned, and facing deteriorating supplies, making it essential for them to acquire new lands for their resources and to recruit troops from their occupied territories. This would allow them to create a buffer between them and the Japanese islands and continue their expansion efforts across the Pacific and Asian continent to maintain their pressure on the Asian colonies of Britain, the Netherlands, Australia, France, New Zealand, and the United States. Anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist sentiment was a continuous strain on Euro-American Asian relations, and nationalist movements for independence sprung up throughout the continent. Japan as a modern nation was born at the height of the imperialist age and had emerged as a powerful, strong, and industrious nation with ambitions of expansion that would rival Europe's and the United States. After Japan had defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Korea had become a Japanese protectorate, and by the end of August 1910, the whole of the Korean peninsula was annexed to become part of Japan. By the 1920s, the Japanese knew their strength in Asia was limited, both in manpower and in resources. Korea provided them with a strong labor force and some of the most important natural resources to help give them the materials they would need to combat their opponents. The Koreans, who had been forcibly incorporated into Japanese culture, law, and society, were made to serve the Japanese throughout the course of the 1920s until the end of the war. Following the fall of the Tsar of Russia in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, the rise of the Soviet Union divided the nation into two factions: the White Army, the internationally supported royalists and anti-communists, and the Communist Red Army. When support from the international community crumbled, the White Army was forced into exile to southeastern Russia to escape the wrath of the Soviet Union, and eventually they provided troops for the Japanese in China, Mongolia, Manchuria, Korea, and southeastern Russia. In the early 1930s, Manchuria, the southeasternmost region of the Soviet Union, and Inner Mongolia lay under Japanese control. Japan recognized the general unrest against the foreign colonists and imperialists as an opportunity to expand their own domain, establishing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or GEA-CPS. This was a proposal by Japan to encourage other Asian nations to resist their imperialist governments and join a financial and military alliance with Japan that would supposedly benefit the Asian continent. The GEA-CPS, however, was just a facade for Japanese imperialism, as it didn't provide the other countries within the proposed coalition with any opportunity for reciprocated success or influence. And Japan was the only state receiving any true supremacy and affluence. With the Japanese invasion and occupation of northeastern China in 1937, sparking the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Nationalist Army started an extensive defensive war under the command of Chiang Kai-shek. Japan needed to maintain its control over its newly acquired territories and formed puppet regimes in Shanghai, Nanking, and Peking. In 1940, Wang Qingwei, a nationalist politician in Nanking, was selected by the Japanese to serve as the head of the reorganized government and form a new military body to help them with their respective missions throughout China. The Nanking Army, however, was a mixture of undisciplined bandits and militia, as well as regular Chinese military units, who had mixed loyalties to either the ebbing Chinese command or to Japanese rule. By the start of the Second World War in 1939, Imperial Japan occupied the Korean Peninsula, Inner Mongolia, northeastern China, eastern China, and southeastern Russia, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, governed by Puyi, the last emperor of China. Puyi agreed to help Japan maintain order and defenses against the growing threats of the Soviet Army, Chinese nationalist forces, and Chinese communist paramilitaries. The military of Manchukuo was originally composed of the army of former warlord Chang Shui-liang, who had fought against the Japanese in the Jehol province in the early 1930s. Between 1938 and 1939, a large division of the Manchukuo forces supported the Japanese Sixth Army in their efforts to defend against the Soviets on the Manchukuo-Mongolian border and continued to recruit troops from Mongolia to serve in their cavalry divisions. But by 1942, Japan needed more men for their operations in Siam and Burma, so they also deployed Manchukuo detachments to protect their interests there. These soldiers fought throughout the war, but were ultimately crushed in 1945 by the Soviet offensive. The survivors were eventually absorbed into the Communist Army to fight in the Chinese Civil War of 1946 to 1949. At the time of the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Second World War, Inner Mongolia, which was situated between the Mongolian People's Republic, Soviet Russia, and northeastern China, allied itself with both Japan and Manchukuo. Made up of autonomous tribes, the Inner Mongolian population provided the occupying force with troops. Led by Prince Taehuang, who was also known as Demchu Dongdrup, the Inner Mongolians provided the Japanese with a powerful cavalry force to help the empire combat the Chinese in northern China and to enforce law and order in the region. Overall, however, the Inner Mongolians only provided between 4,000 and 12,000 men. By the time of Japan's defeat, they had already lost faith in the empire, but still remained loyal to Prince Wang, who was by now looking towards independence. India remained a jewel in the British Empire at the start of World War II, but many anti-British Indian nationalists sought to unify themselves with the Axis powers against Britain. By the start of 1942, during Japan's Malayan campaign, Commander Major Iwaichi Fujiwara used the pro-independence movement throughout India as a weapon to try to subvert the troops who had been fighting under British command. With the promise of being seen as an ally of Japan should they succeed against the British, Pritam Singh, an Indian activist, and POW Captain Mohan Singh of the 114th Punjab Regiment were recruited to form a Free India Army. On February 15, 1942, following the fall of Singapore to the Imperial Japanese Army, the Indian prisoners were separated from their British and Australian comrades and given better treatment to allow Captain Singh to convince them to join the cause. Over the course of 1942, the Indian POWs formed an Indian National Army, or INA, of 40,000 men strong. Captain Singh, however, quickly realized that the Japanese only had their own interests in mind, rather than helping India achieve independence. He was arrested, and the INA was disbanded, returning the POWs to the prison camps. Despite this setback, Major Fujiwara wanted to continue his efforts to push the Indian forces to ally themselves with the Japanese, and reached out to exiled Indian nationalist Subhash Chandra Bose to assist in recruiting Indian support. Bose had been a great political opponent to Mahatma Gandhi, who sought to gain India's independence from Britain through non-violent civil disobedience and peaceful protests. Bose, residing in Nazi Germany in 1941, recruited 2,000 Indian POWs to serve as the Indochine Infantry Regiment 950th, alongside the Wehrmacht in North Africa. In 1943, Bose traveled back to southern Asia and, aided by fellow anti-British revolutionary Rash Behari Bose, arrived in Singapore to lead the new INA and their civilian allies in Malaya to take the British colony and other Southeast Asian regions. The Japanese supplied the Indian Army with weapons captured from the British and used the Indian Army's 1st Division in their occupation of Burma in 1944. Used in a few engagements against the British, the Indian National Army soon found themselves abandoned by the Japanese, who were being pushed back into a retreat. The INA, their civilian allies, and the Japanese scrambled together a new combined force for an offensive in the spring of 1945 to fight in Singapore and Burma. But with the surrender of Japan a few months later, the Indian National Army surrendered their depleted forces to the Allies. Burma had always been a hotbed of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist resistance, and during World War II provided a powerful enemy against their British settlers. 30 men from the Burmese nationalist rebel group the Takins, under the command of Aung San, were sent to Hainan, a Japanese-occupied Chinese island, for military instruction and training. Sent to Bangkok, the 30 comrades recruited 200 Burmese exiles to form the Burmese Independence Army, or BIA, a few months before the Japanese invasion of Burma in December 1941. The BIA grew in numbers, claiming to gather more than 200,000 men from the local Bamar population to fight alongside the Japanese. Aside from the initial 30 comrades, the BIA was at best an unruly mob, and the Japanese struggled to control them, so they had to be disbanded. The Japanese selected the best of the former BIA and created the Burma Defense Army, or BDA, to be trained as an auxiliary unit of the Japanese military. Burma was granted a symbolic independence from Japan in the late summer of 1943, and the BDA now became known as the Burmese National Army, or BNA. Japan refused to allow the BNA to be armed with modern weapons, and they were excluded from combat activities. Aung San realized his best option for Burma to survive was to change sides. He approached the Allies and sought to maintain independence and free Burma from the cruelty of the Japanese. In the early spring of 1945, the BNA began leading combat missions against the occupying Japanese and were supporting the Allied forces. Shortly after the war, Burma was granted its independence on January 4, 1948. By the end of the war in 1945, the Imperial Japanese forces had a strength of around 7 million. Throughout the war, this strength had been increased by its foreign troops, which were made up of Mongolians, Koreans, Han Chinese, Manchus, Indians, Burmese, and others. The Japanese had tried their best to use nationalist and anti-colonial propaganda and sentiment as a means for recruitment and occupation. It can be said, however, that independence was eventually won, but at the cost of millions of lives. At Simple History, we've been working with talented artists on something truly special, a collection of official, premium wall art that captures history's most incredible characters. These aren't just amazing pieces of art, they're timeless treasures designed to inspire and spark conversations for years to come. As a thanks to you, our amazing Simple History community, we're offering an exclusive 25% off these prints. Unlike fleeting trends or short-lived crazes, these prints are designed to be timeless, a lasting treasure you'll proudly display for years to come. They're perfect for any space. Imagine them on the walls of a classroom where they'll inspire students and spark meaningful discussions. Or picture them in your home or office where they'll show off your love of history with sophistication. Don't miss your chance to own one. Click the link in the description below now.